Several years ago, I saw a series of videos by Christian Answers from Austin, Texas. And I contacted them and tried to teach them some things that I thought were wrong, that they were teaching wrong, and I wanted to correct them. But they never responded to me. So I let it go. Now, years later, as I pondered on this, I said, why don't I just make a video and correct them on video? And so this is what this video is all about. Please join me as I go through this through Christian Answers and their study on the early church fathers. And let's see what we can improve in their teaching.
Greetings and welcome once again to our program. I'm Larry Wessels, your host, and I want to thank you for joining us for another edition of Christian Answers. I'm the director of Christian Answers, and I'm with our director of research for Christian Answers, Steve Morrison. Steve, it's great to have you here as usual.
Thank you, Larry.
You did a lot of hard research, a lot of painstaking research on early church history. Basically, what did that entail, just briefly for our audience?
Well, there are between 41 and 4,200 pages in English of all of the writings that we have of the early church writers prior to 325 AD. I have read every page of them, some multiple times, and I've cataloged what they believed, what they experienced, and what they practiced during those times. And I'm going to share the summary of the results with the listeners.
In fact, speaking of all that research, now where do you find, if someone's out there hearing this and they wanted to kind of just verify what you're talking about is true, what are your sources for that? What did you go to some books? Is there a title of a book?
Well, there are two independent ways of verifying. One is you can go on a website. It's called www.ccel.org, and they have the text of almost all of the early church writers. A few of them, such as Adamantius, they don't have, but they have the others. If you want to look at it in print, we recommend a book called, actually it's a series, a 10-volume series called Ante-Nicene Fathers by Hendrickson Publishers. And also the statistics and the summaries and totals are on my website. And you can find them at www.historycart.org/church-history. And you can see all of the graphs that we'll have, not the charts that we'll have in future shows will be out there.
Right. So that's just a quick reference for our viewers out there to show that that material is available. It's available right on your computer. You can also get the books in print. You mentioned Hendrickson's Publishers,
yes,
which you can go online and find them on the internet, just like these other things, to get your hands on books. There's also other big Christian book publishing companies that offer these books for you to get your hands on. What we've done in this series is, through Steve's hard work and research, is we're kind of making it easy for you out there to where you can just get this information in a distilled fashion without having to spend all the time like Steve had to do, where it'll be there for you when you're getting into research that deals with all the attacks against Christianity that you're going to have to deal with as a Christian in this day and age. And that's one reason Christian Answers is here. Basically, I'm an evangelist, and I go out and preach the gospel out in university campuses, on television, on the radio, on the internet, our YouTube videos. I'm debating all types of people. But as a Christian in this day and age, you're going to find that most people just do not accept Christianity. They say it's been changed over the years. It's all messed up and things of that nature. So a series like this dealing with the early church and what they believe, you as a Christian out there can use this type of material to show that what we believe today here in the 21st century actually matches back to the early church, the fathers, Acts chapter 2, if you want to really go back to the early church. It matches now as then. And the evidence is there. And that's what this series is all about. And Steve and his research will be showing us just that. Now,
In this first part of the video, the Christian Answers, they say several things, but one of the things that they say is that the study in the early church fathers hasn't changed, and that is what Christianity is today, and there's no changes. It said it matches now as then, but I have to correct that, because the early church fathers and their writings do not resemble today's Christianity. What it does resemble is the Roman Catholic Church, because those early church fathers, many of their writings were interpolated. No one knows who put their own ideas into the writings, so these writings are not something that we can trust. On the other hand, these writings are something that we need to look at very carefully, because they espouse a lot of Catholic dogma which was interpolated, because if it wasn't there before, now it is. And there are so many things to say about the writings of the Ante-Nicene Fathers, but mainly that now they look like the Catholic Fathers. And that is why there's many people that when they read the Fathers, they believe that the Roman Catholic Church is the true and only church. But of course, they don't understand that these writings have been interpolated. Many of them are spurious, and many of them are forgeries. But the interpolations that have gone into them totally has destroyed any trust that we might have in them. No, the writings of the Ante-Nicene Fathers do not resemble the Christian church today, but more the Roman Catholic Church.
When the Christians were being persecuted, they were people like Athenagoras in 177 AD and Quadratus and Aristides, whom we don't have as much on. But they would write letters to the emperor, and these would be like public letters. And they would say why Christianity is reasonable, why Christians shouldn't be persecuted. After all, if they accepted some of the Greek philosophers, some of whom were atheists, they should accept Christians who believe in one God. And then they also showed why the paganism of Roman and Greek and Egyptian was foolish and silly. Now, maybe that didn't score them any points with pagan emperors, but that's what they did. And they had some very good arguments that were kind of refined later by later writers. Another early church father was Theophilus, Bishop of Antioch. Now, Theophilus, he wrote, as you can see, he wrote about 166 and he died either 181 AD or 188 AD. We're not sure. He was the first person that we have on record to use the word Trinity. And the way he uses it is kind of in an offhand way, like he already presumed that his readers were already familiar with the term. So it had been probably used prior to that. It's just they weren't, we don't have the written records of it. And but ever since Ignatius and the earliest fathers, who we call Jesus is God and everything, it's like there was no debate about the basic concepts behind the Trinity, but the word itself, this is the first use of that.
In speaking about Theophilus of Antioch, they're right in saying that Theophilus was the first one to coin the word Trinity. They're correct in that. I agree 100%. And many people wrongly say it was Tertullian or someone else. Now, the problem that I see in this explanation of Theophilus of Antioch is that they don't explain that even though he was the first to coin the word Trinity, they didn't explain that his Trinity started with an allegorical application. His Trinity at first was not Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It was God, Word, and Wisdom. The allegorical applications that a first century Jewish Greek philosopher gave the Trinity, Philo of Alexandria. So Christian Answers is very limited in what they say about Theophilus of Antioch. And really, they should have gone into why did he teach the Trinity as God, Word, and Wisdom, and where did he get it from? Those questions need to be answered, and we answer them in our books that we have written and over the 500 videos that we've done.
which is actually kind of an outpost of Christianity, you might say, in France. He was an extremely influential writer who was quoted by many early ones. And what he set out to do was to write a listing of every single cult and other religion of his time. And it was quite extensive, showing all the different groups and what was wrong with them and why Christianity was reasonable. And so his basic work is called Irenaeus Against Heresies.
So you're basically saying Irenaeus was sort of like a first century Walter Martin,
Yes.
with his Kingdom of the Cults,
Right,
which
right,
became
right,
famous in the 20th century.
Right, and for that time, written on the manuscripts, Irenaeus' work was pretty massive also. And he taught, and some of the groups we only know from what he wrote. And also Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, who, if you remember, was a disciple of John the Apostle. And Irenaeus had a disciple named Hippolytus. And Hippolytus wrote a refutation of all heresies too, kind of like an updated version of what Irenaeus did. And he wrote about a few other groups.
They touch on Irenaeus, who was a prolific writer, yes. But they don't mention that Irenaeus was the father of Catholic tradition, and that he wrote about all churches submitting unto the Church of Rome. And he taught that the Church of Rome was organized and founded by two apostles, not just Peter, but also the Apostle Paul, which is a lie. Those two apostles never worked together. One was the apostle to the Gentiles, and the other one was the apostle to the Jews. And the one that the Catholic Church says is the first pope is Peter, who was the apostle to the Jews, not to the Gentiles. So they have it wrong either way. It wasn't Peter, and it wasn't the apostle Paul. So Irenaeus has a lot of questionable material that we have to look at and question, instead of just saying that he was a great man and that he taught, just like Theophilus, that God was God, Word, and wisdom. Word was the Son, and wisdom was the Holy Spirit.
First writer that we're going to just briefly highlight is Clement of Alexandria. And he wrote about 193 to either 217 to 220 AD. He also used the word Trinity. He also wrote a hymn about Christ, praising him as God. Now, he tried to co-opt the term Gnostic. Gnostic means like one in the know. And as we know from our previous program, the Gnostics claimed that salvation was through the secret special knowledge, and they had this knowledge. And Clement would say, no, we are the true Gnostics because we're the ones who have the knowledge, not them. So he uses the word Gnostic, but he uses it in a totally different sense to say that the Gnostics are wrong and that we are the Gnostics. Beginning with Clement of Alexandria, you start to see just a little bit of maybe focus on the church versus maybe a little bit less focus on the Bible and a little bit on the tradition. Some people would find he was maybe a little legalistic with some of his stuff. With Clement and later with Tertullian, they were against wearing women wearing any jewelry at all, and some of their other idiosyncrasies, but they really aren't found in the Bible. So things were just kind of starting to go maybe a tiny bit bad here, though, I think Clement was a believer and they, had good guys. Now, the next guy is a very interesting guy named Tertullian. He was a lawyer, worked as a lawyer before he became a Christian, and perhaps while he was a Christian too. And reading his stuff, you just kind of get the sense that here is a really brilliant guy using his mind for Christ. He is kind of the one most people think of. In fact, one book I read erroneously said that he was the first one to use the word Trinity. But he wrote a lot about it. Now, the reason he wrote about it is because there was an alternative belief called Sabellianism. Now, Sabellians have some similarity in their belief about God to oneness Pentecostals today, except they're opposite in a few points. But they said that there's only one God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit are God. So far, so good. But then they said that the Father, Son, and Spirit, one form of kind of called modalism, said that they are the same. There is only one person. There is another variant form called dynamic modalism that says the Father became the Son, became the Spirit. But either way, they don't show a distinction. And so you just kind of just have to say, you know, at Jesus' baptism, what happened? You know, when the Father spoke and the dove came down, you know, Jesus was not a ventriloquist, and Jesus was not a magician to like give the appearance of three and deceive all the people. There really are three distinct beings in one inseparable God. And anyway, their Praxius, who apparently was influencing the Bishop of Rome, was kind of bringing the church that way. And Tertullian stood up and said, no, this is wrong. This is what the Trinity is. And he, besides, you know, showing from the verses in the Bible, he also had a lot of illustrations. Just for example, basically put in modern terms, has anybody seen the sun? Has anybody felt the sun? No, you really haven't. The sun, 93 million miles away, you've never seen it. But what you have is you've seen the rays from the sun. Okay, you felt you felt the heat from the sun. Okay, so has anybody seen God the Father? Well, directly, no. But Jesus is the image of the invisible God. So just like we see the sun's rays, you know, we see the Father through the Son. And just like we feel we can see the effects of God through the Holy Spirit working. And so those are like you know, three parts. They're not separated from each other, but they're actually distinct. And so he had some analogies like that.
Christian Answers also comment on Clement of Alexandria, and they don't say very much about him. But this man, even though he claimed to be a Christian, was also a Gnostic. And if you go through his writings, you will find many things that he got from philosophy and Gnosticism that he applied to the scriptures. And yes, Clement of Alexandria was a disciple also of the first century Jewish Greek philosopher Philo of Alexandria. And he was the head of the school of Alexandria, so that tells you a lot about his connection with Philo. And then the Christian Answers talk about Tertullian, and they talk about Sabellianism. And he starts explaining that as being modalism. But the word modalist does not appear in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. No, it appears way later, maybe 18th century probably, by a Trinitarian scholar who penned that word modalist. But the definition that he gave it is totally wrong and nothing to do with Sabellius. Sabellius was a student of the school of Rome, a theological school where two of the popes of Rome had established a school to teach the oneness of God and were against the Trinity doctrine. Those are things that Christian Answers does not even touch. And Tertullian mentions that the majority of Christians in his day did not want to listen to the Trinity. They were monarchian according to Tertullian. He didn't call him modalist, he didn't call him anything else. Monarchian. Because they held to the unity of one God, and that one God could not be divided. But at the same time, they recognized that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, was also God manifest in the flesh. Interesting, Tertullian mentions, and he says how they looked at him as teaching 2 and 3 gods, and they did not like his teaching at all.
Now, Tertullian, he called himself a Catholic because the word Catholic meant one or universal and part of the Catholic Church. So
you're definitely making a distinction between that term Catholic and what's now considered Roman Catholic.
Right.
Because when you say Catholic these days in the 21st century, usually people interpret that to mean Roman Catholic.
Right.
But you're not saying that at all when you use that term Catholic in this category.
Yeah, and it wasn't me that made the distinction that Tertullian was not a part of the under the bishop at Rome. He left that, and he joined a different group of Christians who were called Montanists. Now, the Montanists were had a lot of similarities to charismatics today. They believed in prophecy going on then. The other church did not discuss prophecy or tongues or anything at all. But it's curious, though, that back then, the Tertullian and the Montanists, they were the staunch defenders of the Trinity. And while most of the church was kind of silent and didn't say too much, the Church of Rome was kind of going the other way toward oneness. And so it was kind of the charismatics with Tertullian that kind of came through and helped the orthodoxy there.
So you're saying the church that was in the city of Rome at that time was actually heading in the wrong direction.
Right, and Tertullian rebuked that. And it was also soon after that time that
I'm so glad that Christian Answers spoke about the 3rd century, where the church was going to become oneness. The popes and the church at that time, they were teaching oneness, and the Trinitarians were small in number, and Tertullian was attacking them. Hippolytus was attacking them and others because they didn't want the church to be oneness. And so I am glad that the Christian Answers mentions that they were going towards oneness. Thank God that there's some truth in this. And Tertullian was against them. Yes, true. But then they say that the word Catholic was universal, and it did not mean Roman Catholic. And they tried to cover this up and say, no, they were just Catholic, not Roman Catholic. But that is wrong. Because if you study the word Catholic, from the first mentions of this word, all the early church fathers meant a group of men who held to a religion, that held to certain traditions, and that worshiped the Mother of God, the ever Virgin Mary, and they held up to the Eucharist, and to the altar and the cup, and to only one bishop presiding over the church, and so many other things. The word Catholic has never really meant universal until probably now. But back then, it meant a certain group of people who were establishing a new religion. As Pope Benedict mentioned in his book, The Fathers, he says that when Justin Martyr went to Rome, he founded a new religion and a new philosophy. This is what's really happening with the word Catholic. And it does not mean just universal.
Probably the most influential person in early church history was a very strange character named Origen, O-R-I-G-E-N. Now, Origen, to give you an idea of his commitment to Christ, when he was a teenager, his father, Leonidas, was martyred for Christ. And as his father was being martyred, he wanted to go outside so he could be martyred too. And his mother hid all his clothes so he couldn't go outside in public so he wouldn't get martyred. And anyway, later on, when he was a young man, there was a wealthy woman who wanted to support him because he had such great, he was such a scholarly researcher, and she also has some translations into Greek of the Old Testament that we don't have today. And Origen was one who did manuscript study to try to say, okay, we have some variations in manuscripts, which is the right one? Now, he wanted to live with her for some years to do this. Now, of course, if a single man living with a single woman, even if he was, pure, there could be like opportunity for talk and scandal. So Origen made absolutely certain there could be no possibility of scandal.
Mm-hmm.
And
I know what he did.
Yeah, absolutely and surgically certain. So whatever criticism you have of Origen, and I do have some criticism, you can't criticize his commitment. 3 ways he was very non-standard, and eventually the church declared him a heretic, but that was like hundreds of years after he died, and he had a lot of influence before then. So
I agree with everything that Christian Answers said about Origen. Origen's had a lot of strange doctrines. And though he was used to, translate and give us the hexapla, he had other things. One of the things that Christian Answers didn't want to answer was that Origen castrated himself using a verse from the Bible where it says, if your arm offend you, cut it off. If your eye offends you, pluck it out. So he didn't want to sin sexually, so he castrated himself. And then also, years later, he was considered and pronounced and excommunicated and called a heretic, along with all others who were not teaching Roman Catholic dogma. So in all of this, I agree, and I thank Christian Answers for being correct on Origen. It is important that we look at all teachers that are expounding on the Apostolic and Ante-Nicene Fathers. And it is good to examine what they're saying and then go and read the works by the Ante-Nicene Fathers so we can find out that most of these people teaching on the early church fathers are leaving things out. And many of them do not touch on things that are important. For example, all Catholic apologists, as my experience shows, never deal with the truth of the early church fathers. They give their version of the Catholic fathers that suits the Roman Catholic Church, but they never talk about those things that shows that they had many problems in doctrine and many problems in the way they saw the gospel.